know he'd come back, but you survived to bear witness. And the very last person he wanted alerted to his return the moment he got back was Dumbledore, said Lupin. And you made sure Dumbledore knew at once. How has that helped? Harry asked. Are you kidding? Said Bill incredulously. Dumbledore was the only one you-know-who was ever scared of. Thanks to you, Dumbledore was able to recall the Order of the Phoenix about an hour after Voldemort returned, said Sirius. So what's the Order been doing? Said Harry, looking around at them all. Working as hard as we can to make sure Voldemort can't carry out his plans, said Sirius. How do you know what his plans are? Harry asked quickly. Dumbledore's got a shrewd idea, said Lupin. And Dumbledore's shrewd ideas normally turn out to be accurate. So what does Dumbledore reckon he's planning? Well, firstly, he wants to build up his army again, said Sirius. In the old days, he had huge numbers at his command. Witches and wizards he'd bullied or bewitched into following him. His faithful Death Eaters, a great variety of dark creatures. You heard him planning to recruit the Giants. Well, there'll just be one group he's after. He's certainly not going to try and take on the Ministry of Magic with only a dozen Death Eaters. So you're trying to stop him getting more followers? We're doing our best, said Lupin. How? Well, the main thing is to try and convince as many people as possible that you-know-who really has returned. To put them on their guard, said Bill. It's proving tricky, though. Why? Because of the Ministry's attitude, said Tonks. You saw Cornelius Fudge after you-know-who came back, Harry? Well, he hasn't shifted his position at all. He's absolutely refusing to believe it's happened. But why? Said Harry desperately. Why is he being so stupid? If Dumbledore... Ah, well, you've put your finger on the problem, said Mr. Weasley with a wry smile. Dumbledore. Fudge is frightened of him, you see, said Tonks sadly. Frightened of Dumbledore? Said Harry incredulously. Frightened of what he's up to, said Mr. Weasley. You see, Fudge thinks Dumbledore's plotting to overthrow him. He thinks Dumbledore wants to be Minister of Magic. But Dumbledore doesn't want... Of course he doesn't, said Mr. Weasley. He's never wanted the minister's job, even though a lot of people wanted him to take it when Millicent Bagnold retired. Fudge came to power instead, but he's never quite forgotten how much popular support Dumbledore had, even though Dumbledore never applied for the job. Deep down, Fudge knows Dumbledore's much cleverer than he is, a much more powerful wizard, and in the early days of his ministry, he was forever asking Dumbledore for help and advice, said Lupin. But it seems that he's become fond of power now and much more confident. He loves being Minister of Magic, and he's managed to convince himself that he's the clever one, and Dumbledore's simply stirring up trouble for the sake of it. How can he think that? Said Harry angrily. How can he think Dumbledore would just make it all up? That I'd make it all up? Because accepting that Voldemort's back would mean trouble like the Ministry hasn't had to cope with for nearly 14 years, said Sirius bitterly. Fudge just can't bring himself to face it. It's so much more comfortable to convince himself Dumbledore's lying to destabilize him. You see the problem, said Lupin. While the Ministry insists there is nothing to fear from Voldemort, it's hard to convince people he's back, especially as they really don't want to believe it in the first place. What's more, the Ministry is leaning heavily on the Daily Prophet not to report any of what they're calling Dumbledore's rumor-mongering. So most of the wizarding community are completely unaware anything's happened, and that makes them easy targets for the Death Eaters if they're using the Imperious Curse. But you're telling people, aren't you? Said Harry, looking around at Mr. Weasley, Sirius, Bill, Mundungus, Lupin, and Tonks. You're letting people know he's back. They all smiled humorously. Well, as everyone thinks I'm a mad mass murderer, and the Ministry's put a 10,000 galleon price on my head, I can hardly stroll up the street and start handing out leaflets, can I? Said Sirius restlessly. And I'm not a very popular dinner guest with most of the community, said Lupin. It's an occupational hazard of being a werewolf. Tonks and Arthur would lose their jobs at the Ministry if they started shooting their mouths off, said Sirius. And it's very important for us to have spies inside the Ministry, because you can bet Voldemort will have them. We've managed to convince a couple of people, though, said Mr. Weasley. Tonks here for one. She's too young to have been in the Order of the Phoenix last time, and having Aurors on our side is a huge advantage. Kingsley Shacklebolt's been a real asset, too. He's in charge of the hunt for Sirius, so he's been feeding the Ministry information that Sirius is in Tibet. But if none of you's putting the news out that Voldemort's back, Harry began. Who said none of us was putting the news out?
Are you
Said
fixing
Sirius.
the
Why do you
refrigerator,
think
Wayne?
Dumbledore's in such trouble? What do you mean? Harry asked.
The
They're
dog?
trying to discredit him, said Lupin. Didn't you see the Daily Prophet last week? They reported that he'd been voted out of the chairmanship of the International Confederation of Wizards because he's getting old and losing his grip. But it's not true. He was voted out by Ministry
What are you
because he
talking
tried to
about,
make a
Wayne?
speech announcing Voldemort's
Come
return.
here.
They've demoted him from Chief Warlock on the Wizard
Come
Court.
here.
That's the Wizard High Court. And they're talking about
Well, if you're
taking away
bringing
his
crap
Order of Murder
upstairs,
First
come here.
Class, too. But Dumbledore says he doesn't care what they do as long as they don't take him off the chocolate frog cards,
Come
said
here.
Bill, grinning. It's
Don't
no
step on my
laughing matter,
stuff.
said Mr.
Hug
Weasley
me.
shortly.
So,
If he
No,
carries
you
on
got to
defying
come
the
down.
Ministry like this,
You
he could
stink.
end up in
Shower.
Azkaban.
Yeah,
and the
now you're
last
gonna
thing
be
we
on
want
YouTube.
is Dumbledore locked up. While
you stink,
you
take
know
a shower?
who knows Dumbledore's
Well,
out there
whatever
and
you
why
just
he's doing what
did.
he's up to, he's
Yep.
going to go cautiously for a while. If Dumbledore's out of the way, well, you know who will have a clear field. But if Voldemort's trying to recruit more Death Eaters, it's bound to get out that he's come back, isn't it? Asked Harry desperately. Voldemort doesn't march up to people's houses and bang on their front doors, Harry, said Sirius. He tricks, jinxes, and blackmails them. He's well practiced at operating in secrecy. In any case, gathering followers is only one thing he's interested in. He's got other plans, too. Plans he can put into operation very quietly indeed, and he's concentrating on them at the moment. What's he after apart from followers? Harry asked swiftly. He thought he saw Sirius and Lupin exchange the most fleeting of looks before Sirius said, stuff he can only get by stealth. When Harry continued to look puzzled, Sirius said, like a weapon. Something he didn't have last time. When he was powerful before? Yes. Like what kind of weapon? Said Harry. Something worse than the Avada Kedavra? That's enough. Mrs. Weasley spoke from the shadows beside the door. Harry had not noticed her return from taking Ginny upstairs. Her arms were crossed, and she looked furious. I want you in bed now, all of you, she added, looking around at Fred, George, Ron, and Hermione. You can't boss us, Fred began. Watch me, snarled Mrs. Weasley. She was trembling slightly as she looked at Sirius. You've given Harry plenty of information. Any more, and you might just as well induct him into the Order straight away. Why not? Said Harry quickly. I'll join. I want to join. I want to fight. No. It was not Mrs. Weasley who spoke this time, but Lupin. The Order is comprised only of over-age wizards, he said. Wizards who have left school, he added, as Fred and George opened their mouths. There are dangers involved of which you can have no idea, any of you. I think Molly's right, Sirius. We've said enough. Sirius half shrugged, but did not argue. Mrs. Weasley beckoned imperiously to her sons and Hermione. One by one they stood up, and Harry, recognizing defeat, followed suit. Chapter 6. The Noble and Most Ancient House of Black. Mrs. Weasley followed them upstairs, looking grim. I want you all to go straight to bed, no talking, she said as they reached the
I haven't
next
gone
landing.
up here,
We've got to
smart
visit tomorrow.
ass.
I expect Ginny's asleep, she added to Hermione, so try not to wake her up. Asleep, yeah, right, said Fred in an undertone after Hermione bade them good night and they were climbing to the next floor. If Ginny's not lying awake waiting for Hermione to tell her everything they said downstairs, then I'm a flubberworm. All right, Ron, Harry, said Mrs. Weasley on the second landing, pointing them into their bedroom. Off to bed with you. Night, Harry and Ron said to the twins. Sleep tight, said Fred, winking.